Mississippi, 1858. The Yazoo River crawled through the delta like a slow vein of copper, reflecting the white glare of the sun. Cotton leaves trembled in the still air, and the whip-poor-wills had given up their song hours ago. In that hush of heat, a man could go mad listening to his own breath, unless he had none left to lose. That, they said, was what made the tall one different. Homer the Silent had not uttered a word in years. He arrived at the New Orleans Exchange chained to 7 other men, each tagged with a wooden plaque hanging from his neck. His read only, Homer, mute, exceptional size. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, shoulders wide as a doorframe, with eyes that seemed to hold the color of storm water. When the auctioneer barked for him to speak, he simply lifted his hand, pressed his palm to his throat, and shook his head once. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the buyers. Colonel Abner Crane of Yazoo County elbowed his way to the front. "A quiet one," he said, stroking his beard. "My overseer complains of too much talk in the quarters. Maybe this one will set an example." He bid $850, nearly double the going rate, and won. The trader who wrote the receipt added a note in the margin. Possibly tongueless. Homer was loaded into a wagon with barrels of salt pork. During the 3-day journey north, the driver swore he never saw the giant sleep. "He watches the trees," the man told Crane later, "like he remembers them." Crane Plantation covered 2,000 acres of black river soil. Rows of cabins squatted behind the big house like punctuation marks on a single cruel sentence. The overseer, Amos Trigg, met them at the gate. "What's this monster you bought, Colonel?" he asked. "Monster that doesn't talk." Trigg cracked his whip in the air for show. Homer didn't flinch. That unsettled everyone. They put him to work, clearing stumps along the bayou road. Each swing of his axe came down clean and steady, the rhythm so exact that other workers began matching his pace without realizing it. That sound, one old field hand remembered years later, was like a heart that kept beating after the world had quit. Crane's wife Delia wrote in her diary that the dogs refused to bark when Homer passed. "They sense what men ignore," she scribbled. The quarters told darker stories, that he had once shouted during a whipping, and the master had killed a woman for the noise. Since that night, they said, he had vowed silence so God himself would have to listen. By midsummer, the fields shimmered with heat. Tempers cracked like dry cane. One afternoon, a storm gathered fast and black. Crane ordered the pickers to stay in the rows until every basket was full. When lightning struck a cypress and trapped a boy beneath it, Homer ran without permission, heaving the trunk aside. Crane saw rebellion where there was mercy. "You move when I tell you," he shouted and lashed the whip. Once, twice. Then his hand froze midair. He staggered, gasping, fingers clawing at his throat. The workers watched in stunned silence as their master collapsed. The coroner wrote apoplexy. Delia Crane whispered that the lightning had changed direction. The enslaved called it the first breath returned. Within a week, Homer was sold again. The trader who hauled him south kept a diary. One entry read, "The big mute never closes his eyes, makes the night heavy." At the Natchez market, Major Whitcomb bought him out of curiosity. Whitcomb prided himself on collecting rare things: Arabian horses, Chinese porcelain, and now a 7-foot man who would not speak. "A statue that works," he told his guests. For months, Homer stood at the plantation gate, greeting visitors by presence alone. Children crept up to touch his hands. "He's gentle," they said. "Too gentle," Whitcomb's wife warned. The Major only laughed. "If he ever misbehaves, I'll make him sing for mercy." One morning, Whitcomb ordered Homer to lift a young horse into a paddock to show off his strength. The colt panicked, kicking and screaming. Whitcomb, drunk on spectacle, whipped it. The horse reared and struck him squarely in the chest. He fell dead before the echo faded. Homer stood still, staring at the animal as rain began without clouds. The slaves buried the Major that night and prayed over his widow. She sold Homer at sunrise. He went next to Captain Dillard, a retired riverboat officer turned cane planter. Dillard believed noise kept men obedient. Silence was an insult. He ordered a collar of small brass bells fixed around Homer's neck. "If he won't speak, he'll still make sound," Dillard said. For weeks the bells jingled through the fields, each step mocking the captain's authority. When a hurricane slammed the coast that September, Dillard locked every worker in the barn so none could flee. The roof caved in at midnight. Dillard was found pinned beneath a rafter, throat crushed. Homer, still chained, carried survivors into the open air. The collar's bells were gone. No one ever found them. By the time he reached his fourth owner, a lumber merchant named Paxton, the story of the mute giant preceded him like a shadow. Paxton, skeptical and greedy, bought him cheap. "If curses were real, I'd be dead already," he joked. He set Homer to work, hauling logs. 2 months later, a saw chain snapped and struck Paxton across the jaw. The physician who examined him swore the wound looked guided by hand, not accident. The rumor of the curse deepened. Next came the Carter brothers, twins who co-owned a cotton estate near Greenville. They argued over everything, including what to do with Homer. One saw him as a miracle of labor, the other as an omen. Their fights turned vicious. One stormy night, neighbors heard a crash of furniture and a single heavy step. At dawn, both brothers lay dead beside the fireplace, faces blue. The coroner wrote asphyxiation from drink. The workers whispered, "The tall man took their air and gave it back to the Lord." By 1859, Homer's legend reached the banks of the Mississippi, like flood water, slow, unstoppable, and muddy with fear. Slave traders began adding disclaimers to his bill of sale. "Strong worker, ill luck follows." In the taverns of Natchez, men swore the mute giant could summon storms. In the quarters, they said he carried the breath of God cupped inside his chest. Either way, the story traveled faster than he did. His seventh owner, Dr. Leland, fancied himself enlightened. A physician by trade, he called slavery a necessary experiment in human order. He bought Homer for the novelty of treating a man without voice. Leland believed silence was illness, not choice. He fitted a wooden collar around Homer's neck to keep his head upright for observation. Each evening he pried open the man's mouth with polished tongs, searching for scars. Finding none, he concluded, "The tongue remains whole, but disobedient." He dosed him with bitter tonics and waited for speech. But Homer gave him nothing. When fever swept the quarters, it was Homer who carried the sick to the infirmary. He sat beside them through the night, cooling foreheads with wet cloths. They said his presence eased the pain. Leland's wife wrote in her diary, "The mute giant nurses them better than medicine. I fear my husband's envy will kill him before the fever does." Weeks later, the doctor's horse spooked on the levee road. The animal bolted. Leland fell beneath the cartwheel. The spoke crushed his throat. The coroner called it misfortune. The field hands said, "Judgment keeps its own calendar." The eighth master was Mr. Rourke, a banker who collected debts as if they were souls. He believed in control more than cruelty, which often amounts to the same thing. Rourke bought Homer at half price and worked him clearing new cotton ground. He chained him each night inside a tool shed, claiming it was for protection. The workers whispered that they heard two sets of breathing from inside, one human, one heavier. At dawn one morning, Rourke was found dead on the shed floor, face pale, eyes open, no wound except a dark bruise across his neck, wide as a man's palm. The sheriff said apoplexy again. The preacher in the quarters said, "That makes 8. The 9th and final master was Captain Malvern, a man born mean and polished by war. He'd worn Confederate grey long after the surrender, refusing to believe the world had changed. He bought Homer not for labor, but for show. A monument, he called him, to the old order. He made the giant walk beside his carriage on Sundays, barefooted, while he paraded through town in starched linen. Children laughed, women looked away. Malvern's pride fed on humiliation. One night he summoned Homer to the veranda with a bottle of whiskey and a pistol. "You're my trophy," he slurred. "Say my name so the Lord knows who owns you." Silence. He struck Homer across the jaw. The pistol fell, clattering on the boards. Malvern lunged to grab it, tripped, and slammed his throat against the edge of the marble step. The sound, they said, was like a tree snapping in winter. Homer didn't move. He knelt beside the body and closed the man's eyes. The sheriff arrived before dawn. Homer waited in the yard, hands folded, palms up. He didn't resist. The sheriff told reporters later. He looked peaceful, like a preacher who'd said his last amen. The Yazoo City courthouse squatted beside the river, 2 stories of brick sweating in the heat. They marched Homer through the square in chains thick as anchor rope. Hundreds came to watch. Planters in linen, freedmen in patched coats, children with lemonade cups. The judge called for order, though none existed. "Homer, do you understand the charges?" Silence. "Do you deny them?" Silence again. Witnesses filled the stand with rumor. One swore he saw Homer twist a whip handle in half. Another claimed storms followed him. The prosecutor built his case on fear. 9 dead white men, 1 black body still breathing. "If this is not murder," he thundered, "then nature herself has turned against us." The defense offered a single plea, that a man denied voice could not defend himself. The jury took 10 minutes. "Guilty," they said. "Death by hanging, June 11th. That night in the jailhouse, Reverend Elijah Brown asked permission to pray with the condemned. He found Homer sitting cross-legged, eyes half-closed. "Brother," Brown whispered, "was it anger or mercy drove your hand?" Homer lifted one massive palm and placed it over the preacher's heart. The Reverend swore later that the touch felt like forgiveness, so heavy it bent his spine. Dawn broke cruel and clear. Wagons rolled in from every direction. Vendors sold pies and cider near the gallows. The sheriff wiped sweat from his neck. When they led Homer up the steps, the crowd fell into an uneasy hush. The rope looked thin against his shoulders. "If you have last words," the sheriff said, "speak them now." Homer raised his head toward the sun, pressed his hand to his throat, and let it fall. A murmur swept the spectators, some weeping, some laughing to hide it. The hangman pulled the lever. The beam groaned once. Then the rope snapped. Gasps rippled through the crowd. When the dust cleared, the platform was empty. The sheriff claimed later they buried him by the levee at midnight, unmarked. But farmers woke the next morning to find black handprints of soot on their barn doors, wide and unmistakable. They scrubbed them clean. By dusk, the prince returned. They called it a hanging, but it was closer to a spectacle. Newspapers from Jackson to Memphis printed short paragraphs. Mutinous slave executed, rope breaks, crowd terrified. By the time reporters reached Yazoo, the body was gone. The sheriff swore he buried Homer by torchlight under the levee. Others said they saw him walking into the swamp, the river shining like mercury around his knees. Weeks passed, and stories multiplied. Cattle refused to cross certain fords. A sharecropper found handprints burned into the door of a cotton press. Whenever thunder rolled over the delta, someone would whisper, "The tall man's moving again." Fear travels easily in a country that once ran on fear. After the war, Reconstruction teachers collected oral histories for northern societies. Among the broken grammar and remembered hymns, Homer's name appeared again and again. He never said a word, but the sky listened, one woman told a reporter in 1872. Another, a man called Isaac Reed, said, "Master after master died like fish pulled from water. The Lord let one man's silence do the talking for all of us." Preachers turned him into parable. In brush arbor meetings they sang, "He don't shout, he don't cry, he just breathed the wicked dry." Some versions claimed he rose from the grave. Others said he walked north and joined the Union Army, still mute, carrying an axe instead of a rifle. The details changed, but the shape of faith remained. A single man so wronged that even heaven had to answer. To the planters who survived the war, the tale was an embarrassment. They called it superstition, insisting the deaths were coincidence. Reverend Coleman, a former slaveholder turned Reconstruction preacher, wrote a pamphlet titled "Against the Myth of the Silent Negro." "No such creature existed," he declared. "These stories are told to justify lawlessness." Yet when lightning struck the steeple of his church a month later, even he hesitated before printing a second edition. In 1932, a Works Progress Administration writer named Samuel Aldridge traveled through Yazoo County collecting slave narratives. He expected stories of whips and cotton, not ghosts. Every interview circled back to Homer. Old women pointed toward the river and said, "He sleeps there." Children recited rhymes they didn't understand. Aldridge, skeptical but curious, followed the rumors to a pecan tree near the ruins of Crane Plantation. He found the stump of a scaffold beam buried in its roots. When wind passed through the branches, the sound was low and hollow, like air drawn through a throat. Aldridge described it in his notebook. "I felt I was being watched by silence itself." He took a photograph, filed his report, and left the negative unprinted. His final note read, "Some histories refuse the page." By the 1940s, Delta bluesmen had folded the legend into their music. Blind Curtis sang "The Giant of Yazoo" on a 78 RPM record, his slide guitar wailing like a rope stretching. The lyrics told of a man so tall he touched the thunder. The song sold poorly, banned by a local station for inciting unrest. But traveling musicians carried the tune westward. It resurfaced in Texas work camps, in Louisiana prisons, and later in gospel choirs that softened the story into metaphor. Silence, they said, was holiness refusing corruption. In each retelling the details blurred, yet the pattern held. Injustice met by restraint so profound, it became judgment. Where white chroniclers sought confession, black storytellers found communion. Today, the land where Homer once labored is divided into soybean plots. The old levee is a highway embankment. Drivers pass the marker without slowing. Yazoo River scenic overlook. But locals still speak of nights when fog rolls in and the air grows heavy, when even the frogs fall quiet. "That's him," a farmer told me in 2019, "the big man keeping watch." I walked that ground myself at dusk. The river smelled of iron. Each step sank an inch into history. The silence wasn't empty. It pulsed. Cicadas paused. The wind stopped. And for a heartbeat, I felt the weight of all the unsaid words that built this country. What remains of Homer is not a body or a record, but an argument. Can silence be rebellion? Can dignity survive without speech? 9 men died, perhaps by chance, perhaps by consequence. Their deaths left a scar that maps the border between fear and faith. Historians chase evidence, but folklore preserves meaning. Maybe Homer never crushed a throat. Maybe he simply endured until guilt collapsed around him. Yet endurance in a system built to erase endurance is a kind of war. Every day he lived without yielding was another nail in the coffin of his master's certainty. I imagine his final walk to the gallows, the dust rising behind him, townspeople crowding for a better view, children hoisted onto shoulders. He sees them all, then looks past them to the river. He knows sound is what keeps this world spinning, orders, screams, justifications, and that the only way to stop it, even for a heartbeat, is to withhold the breath it feeds on. So he takes one last inhale and holds it, and the rope snaps. What do you think about the story of Homer the Silent? Was he a victim driven beyond endurance, or an instrument of divine reckoning in a world without mercy? Were the men who died casualties of their own cruelty, or reflections of a system that left no one clean? Can we judge those forced to choose between silence and survival? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next account of courage, silence, and endurance. Share it with someone who believes history must be faced, not forgotten. At History in Chains, we tell these stories honestly, acknowledging that the past was never simple, that within cruelty there was endurance, and within silence, defiance, because remembering is its own form of justice. See you in the next episode.